Well, my name is Jay Kaiser. Today is September 11th, ominous date, and I'm interviewing Noam Chomsky. And Noam, I wanted to ask you a question that actually was brought to me by Sylvan Bromberger. And Sylvan and Morris and I often sit around and talk about the state of linguistics, and Sylvan made a comment which actually surprised me. He was saying that he thought that linguistics today was roughly at the same stage that physics was at the time of Kepler and Galileo and Huygens. And he said, in order to back up that point, he said, look, you talk about movement and merge, but what does that mean in terms of the brain? He says, it's really just marks on a piece of paper. It's just the way you're forced to do it. And I wondered, he said in the same way that these guys, Galileo and company, needed a Newton in order to make sense of their calculations. He thinks that that's what linguistics needs. And what do you think about that?
Well, I'm a little hesitant about analogies because the topics are so different and the level of achievement is so different and so on. But there's something to it. And in fact, Kepler and Galileo and Newton did, this is part of the Galilean revolution, tried to provide an explanatory basis for the theoretical analyses that they were giving of the tides and the motion of planets and so on. And Galileo pretty much formulated, it was sharpened later in the century, it was essentially a mechanical model. The world is a machine. And by machine, they meant, in the common sense, understanding of machine, like gears and levers and things pushing each other and so on. And they even had concrete models in mind. Worth remembering that at that period there was tremendous fascination with automata. Jacques de Vaucanson was making models of a duck that digested these incredible fountains and the royal palaces and so on.
Yeah, I remember
complicated clocks.
The ducks would eat and then would actually defecate and emit a foul-smelling odor.
Right. And but there was the same. In fact, it's kind of like today in some respects. There was kind of an obsession and fascination with complex machines. And the Galilean concept later developed was, okay, the world is just a machine, just like the kind of complex machine that Jacques de Vaucanson develops, except more complicated and made by a much greater master, perfect master. But that's the explanatory model. So yes, they did have, in response to Sylvan's comment, they actually had an explanatory basis. Trouble is, it was wrong.
Right.
And Galileo already recognized that something's wrong. Toward the end of his days, he said, I think we're never going to explain anything because I cannot construct mechanical models to deal with, say, the tides and planetary motions and so on. So he kind of left in despair. Descartes came along and felt that he had created a mechanical model. Descartes, what people read in philosophy classes, is not what Descartes was interested in. And his main work was his physics, then called philosophy. Philosophy meant physics. Is
this business of psychophysical parallelism?
Well, he ran into a problem. He thought that he could develop a pure mechanical model for everything that happened in the world, in the inorganic world, for everything that happened with animals, even for most of humans, up to sensation, in fact. But when he considered certain aspects of humans, and strikingly the most dramatic for him was the way language is used, he said there's no way to construct a mechanical model for this, the way in what's nowadays sometimes called the creative use of language, which he observed, the ability of every person to produce and understand an indefinite number of expressions Newton, the person, to do it with not in ways that are appropriate to situations, but not caused by the situation. So it's not like a reflex response. And as far as anyone can tell, independent of internal stimuli. So there's some capacity, which is true of action generally, human action, he thought, but is most striking in the case of language. And these expressions that we produce, sentences that I'm producing, others may not have thought of them, but they can understand them, and they know that they could have expressed that thought the same way. Right, this capacity, he argued, is beyond the range of a machine. And that's where the mind-body dualism comes from. There's machines that deal with everything, in the case of humans, all the way up to sensation and certain aspects of perception, but it hits a limit. And the creative use of language was his most striking example of the limit. Actually, that led to interesting work in the 17th century by his disciples, trying to develop experimental tests that would determine whether some other creature who looks like us is in fact has this special capacity with a mind. And so you try this experiment and that experiment, and the conclusion was, well, if they pass every experiment we can devise, it would be unreasonable for us not to conclude that they have a mind like ours. These experiments are straight science. They're like a litmus test for acidity. There's a property that he claimed was in the world, namely mind, and we have to see if some entity or creature has it, so we do tests. Now, that's a little bit like what's now called the Turing test, except much more reasonable. The Turing test makes absolutely no sense. In fact, Turing was quite aware of that. There's a brief paper on the subject that opens by saying that the question is whether machines think is too meaningless to deserve discussion. And then he goes on to talk about other things. That's led to a huge, and in my view, most pointless industry. But the 17th century analogs made perfectly good sense. There's a conception of the world based on machines, and that's the basis for explanation that Sylvan's talking about. And it ran into a limit. Something was apparently beyond that limit, so therefore you have to invoke another principle. And then you do experiments to see where that principle holds. And of course, Descartes wrestled with the idea of how these two substances in his metaphysics interacted. Is it through the pineal gland? Is it some other way? And, that's what the huge debates about philosophy of mind were about. Well, it collapsed. Newton showed that it didn't work. He showed that the world is not a machine. So there is action at a distance, which an artisan cannot construct. An artisan cannot construct something in which two things that have no connection between them affect one another. But Newton's discoveries were that the Cartesian mechanics didn't work, John effect that no mechanics would work, and you had to have some other kind of system which had abstract forces in it. Now Newton regarded this as an absolute absurdity, and he said no person with reasonable scientific intelligence can contemplate this for a moment, and he spent most of the rest of his life trying to get around it. And the great scientists of his day, like Christian Huygens and Leibniz and others, just mocked it. They said he's reintroducing occult ideas like the neo-scholastics, sympathies, antipathies, everything that science was trying to get away from. And Newton's answer, which was important, was to concede that he was introducing mystical ideas, but they're not like the occult ideas of the neo-scholastics, because he had a mathematical theory from which you could make predictions, making use of these ideas. So there's no basis for it. The basis had been kicked out from under them, but because machines don't work. But nevertheless, there was an explanatory model, and that's where science went on from there. I mean, actually, if you look at the details, for centuries, great scientists tried to show that there is some mechanical basis, but finally recognize that's not the way to look at it. You have to, what in fact it meant was lowering the levels of expectation for science. An explanation will be intelligible to us, Galileo and Newton thought, if we can give a mechanical model for it. But it was finally recognized we can't give mechanical models. That means the world is not intelligible to us, so we do the best we can. We get the best kinds of theories we can and try to explain things as best as we can, recognizing that there are ultimate mysteries. In fact, David Hume, in his as a history of England, so a section on Newton, who he describes as one of the greatest thinkers the world has ever seen, and he said that Newton's most significant legacy to us is to show that there are mysteries of nature which are beyond our comprehension. And he didn't mean the nature of the meaning of life. He meant the motion of the planets, the rolling of the ball down an inclined plane, and so on.
So do you think that...
So I don't think, in a sense, that the comment is correct, that there's no basis known, neural basis known for the theoretical constructions.
Yeah.
But in a sense, that's the nature of science. Now, this case is a little different, because I think there's every reason to expect that there will be a neural basis. Whereas, as Newton showed, there's not going to be a mechanical basis. So this is not a mystery of the Humean type. It's just lack of knowledge. However, there may be mysteries there. I mean, it's what Descartes called, or what has been called, the creative aspect of language use, these Cartesian observations. And no one has any idea what the physical basis of that might be.
Why do you think that there might be reason to believe that there'll be some neural basis for movement or merge or traces?
Well, there's no reason to doubt it, and if there's no reason to doubt it, we look for it. Just as Galileo, it was perfectly sensible for Galileo to look for mechanical explanations.
Do you have any idea what it might look like?
Not really. I mean, even for insects, the neural basis for what they do is essentially unknown.
Yeah.
These are not trivial questions.
Yeah.
In the case of humans, it's especially difficult because of ethical reasons. We don't permit ourselves to do the kinds of experiments that would shed light on it.
Right.
So if you did invasive experiments, take, say, the visual system. And we know a lot about the human visual system and the neural basis and which cells do which things and so on and so forth. But the reason is because we allow ourselves to torture cats and monkeys, and they have approximately the same visual system. So we do experiments with, highly invasive experiments with monkeys and kittens. You learn a lot about how it works. We assume that the human visual system must be more or less the same, as far as we know it is. But there's no other organism to work on in the case of language. It's in all of its essential characteristics. It's a unique human possession. And you can't do controlled experiments. Like, for example, there's a lot of effort to investigate what's called poverty of stimulus. It's just a name for everything that happens in growth and development. And it's given a name in the case of language just for mystical reasons. It holds for everything. So the fact that a human grows a mammalian visual system, but not an insect visual system, is not determined by the visual environment. The fact that we have arms and not wings doesn't depend on the food we eat, and so on. So yes, there's a huge gap between the external information, if you like it, in a general sense, coming in and the way the organism develops. And that's true of language like everything else. Since language is looked at kind of mystically for cultural reasons, this is considered a problem. In fact, it's not a problem. It's just saying language like everything else. But there's a lot of study of it. So, like, exactly what kind of data is required for the infant to gain the capacity that we're now using. Well, there would be ways of studying this, namely raise children in isolation or with deprived stimulation. Not going to do that. So there are natural experiments, but no controlled experiments. So many questions that could be settled with straightforward experiments just can't be carried out. And the same with the neurological basis. Instead of doing invasive experimentation on the brain, trying to figure out what particular cells do and so on, what's done is fMRI, studying things that you can look at from the outside without invasive procedures. So it's much harder to do than for insects. But even for insects, the answers are not known. These are not trivial scientific questions. I mean, insects do incredible things.
Yeah.
And the neural basis for it, even the neural basis for the most elementary calculations that enter into insect behavior is only really speculative. Randy Gallistos, one famous neuroscientist, has written about this. These are hard topics. And the expectation that we're going to have a neural account for thought, language, and so on it's just not realistic. I mean, even in physics, if questions get too complicated, physicists don't even try to solve them. They give them to chemists. So if some molecule is too big for a physicist to deal with, he tells the chemist, okay, it's your problem. And if it gets too complicated for the chemist, they give it to the biologist. If it's too complicated for the biologist, they give it to the historian. But as is the problem. So part of the reason why, the hard sciences make deep discoveries is that they artificially restrict the domain of inquiry. And incidentally, that's another contribution of Galileo. I mean, sort of understood before, but he sharpened the understanding that if you want to gain any insight into some system, you don't have to move away from phenomena and towards abstraction, towards idealization. So instead of studying a leaf blowing in the wind, study a ball rolling down a frictionless plane, even though that doesn't exist.
Right.
That way, maybe you can gain some understanding, which you can use for more complicated topics. Well, to be concrete, suppose that you wanted to predict what's going on outside the window. Okay. The only way to do it would be brute force. Take thousands of videotapes of whatever's happening outside the window, do some statistical analysis, and probably get a pretty fair prediction of what's going to happen next. You don't go to the physics department. They can't say a thing about outside the window. Hillary Putnam once made an analogy. He said quantum physicists can't explain why a round peg doesn't fit into a square hole. It's just way too complicated. But if you want to discuss to understand the phenomena, there's only two ways. One is brute force, which will give you some weak correlations, or else just abstract away from them and study ideal cases. And that's sometimes called the Galilean style. Attribute more reality to the ideal case, even in a non-existent system like a frictionless plane, than we do to the phenomena that are just too complicated because there's too many variables and too many interacting things. And that's quite important for the study of language. I mean, in fact, it's a live battle in the study of language. Should we just study the mass of phenomena and use brute force methods to try to model them somehow? Or should we abstract away from the complex phenomena and try to find ideal cases that we'll be able to investigate and maybe find some principles? In fact, that's the first step. Take say, the notion of language. I mean, there's an intuitive, common sense notion of language, in which, for example, Chinese is a language and romance isn't a language. But the factors that enter into that are historical, colors on maps, continuity of empires. I mean, it's not a linguistic distinction.
Right.
And if you try to study that, you're studying all of human life. So you won't find any.
I was struck by your comment that, if you eat one thing, you grow arms. If you eat another, you grow wings. There's a book that has recently appeared by Richard Wrangham about the role of food in evolution. And his argument is that there's a correlation between brain size and gut size. And the smaller the gut, the larger the brain. And that's precisely because of what kind of food you eat.
It's because, he claims, because of cooking.
Right.
What he claims is that around, it's kind of speculative, but that roughly 2 million years ago, you get the emergence of a new kind of proto-human fossil, Homo erectus.
Right.
And it started having a much smaller digestive system from the mouth and the jaw to the gut and everything else. And in fact, it's true. If you look at a monkey, huge jaw, big stomach, and so on and so forth. But, and he said, well, speculation is, well, this happened because humans started eating cooked food, which is much easier to digest, to get much more energy from it, and so on. So you could evolve to a creature which had a much smaller digestive system, and the kind of spare energy that was around could go into developing a bigger brain.
Yeah.
And,
what do you think about explanations like that?
plausible. Like most evolutionary explanations, it's a kind of a, you try to make a plausible construction of what might have happened. Actually, to give a real explanation in terms of natural selection is no trivial matter.
Yeah.
And in fact, there aren't many cases. It makes sense. Nobody doubts that natural selection takes place, but to try to nail it down is not easy.
Well,
And in fact, it's now known that it's only one of many factors in evolution. Like about, maybe I forgot the numbers, but I think close to half of our genes, something very high, come from something that's called transposition. They come from other species. In fact, even that's true even of a cell, the mitochondria, it's kind of like a bacteria that gets into the cell. So there's all kind of complicated processes going on in evolution, of which natural selection is surely one. And these explanations are kind of plausible stories of more or less plausibility. There's some complications with this one too, because apparently there's no archaeological evidence for the use of fire that early. The archaeological evidence is several hundreds of thousands of years later, I think. But it does seem to make sense.
The explanation rang a bell with me. I think Charles Lamb wrote an essay about how a pig got caught in a hut that got on fire, and that was his explanation for how we acquired it.
That's pretty much the same thing that he's saying.
But tell me now, am I wrong? My feeling was that several decades ago, you thought that evolutionary explanations were really part of the mystery. We never really existed. It was something we could never understand. And now it seems to me that you're more willing to consider possibility of making progress there. And I'm just wondering, A, is that true? And if it is true, what's caused the change?
Well, first of all, there don't have to cite me. They're very distinguished evolutionary biologists to take this position. Like Richard Lewontin is the best known case. Richard Lewontin.
Oh, sure.
And in the MIT Invitation to Cognitive Science, is now a 4-volume book in its latest edition.
Yeah, he's really good.
He had the article on evolution of cognition. In the first edition, I think it was 15 or so years ago, he wrote a very pessimistic article explaining why he thought we're never going to learn anything about the evolution of cognition. Not because it was a mystery in Hume sense, but because the methods of inquiry were such that we just wouldn't be able to do it. So if we had tape recordings of what happened 2 million years ago, okay, maybe we could do it. It's not a Newtonian mystery, just a lack of ability. In the second edition, he repeats the article, and then he adds an epilogue in which he says, well, the editors asked me if I could say something a little more upbeat. And he said, I'd like to, but facts are facts. I'm never going to learn anything about it. But that was that's the way it looked to me too, but kind of for technical reasons. The contemporary linguistics, which sort of took off in the 50s, the first thing it tried to do was it tried to satisfy several conditions. First of all, it took a narrow view of language, not Chinese, that's what it was, but whatever happens to be in your brain and my brain, and in fact, even idealizing away from that, because all of us have many different dialects in our head. So idealized down to a kind of an ideal, pure system, hoping to account for the complications in other ways, as in all the sciences, and then see if you can give an account of that, which will meet several conditions. First has to be what was called descriptively adequate. Just has to get the facts straight. Secondly, it has to meet a condition of explanatory adequacy, namely showing how an infant, given the data it has, can attain this system. So then you'd have if you could do that, which would attribute something to the nature of the infinite, genetic endowment, you'd have a certain level of explanation of what the person actually does. They do it because they have this internal system, they have that internal system because the genetic endowment interacting with the environment led to the growth of this system. So that's a pattern of an explanation. Those are the basic questions, a lot of other ones. But they ran into an immediate contradiction, which was a hard problem, still by no means solved. The problem is that if you try to get a descriptively adequate account of a language, it is extremely intricate. It has a lot of complexities, a lot of special rules, special properties, stipulations. Different languages look different from one another. But they, in health, fundamental work for a long time seemed to show that languages differed in such a fundamental property as what was called configurationality.
Right.
That they have structures, or they hierarchy, or they just kind of words organized with other principles, acting on no phrases. And that looks like an enormous difference. And there are many other such cases. Well, as long as you have, as the descriptions are complex and varied, you're not going to be able to deal with the problem of explanatory adequacy.
Right.
Because what you have for explanatory adequacy, you have to show they're all basically the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the differences are kind of minor modifications on a kind of fixed mold. So there was a kind of a tension that made it impossible either to meet these, even to meet these conditions, let alone to go on to the question of evolution. Because evolution has to do with the question of how this fixed innate element evolved. And if you can't figure out what that is, you can't raise the question of evolution in any serious way. Well, over time, it's been possible to a considerable extent to resolve the tension. So it takes a configurationality. Very significant, subtle work by quite a number of people showed that it was apparently an illusion. That if you look more and take Kim's main case was Wolverine, which looked like the extreme case of non-configurationality. But work by him and his students, Julie Legate for one, showed that in fact, if you looked at the language the right way and looked at subtle enough aspects of it, you found that it really was configuration. And it even had movement rules and the kind of rules you find elsewhere. And the same was found about Japanese and other languages thought to be non-configuration. And the same happened with other properties. So there's gradual progress towards showing that the apparent variety and diversity and complexity is superficial, and that in fact, there is a fundamental uniformity. Actually, the same thing's been happening in biology. So if you go back not very long, a couple of decades, you could read by famous, leading, highly reputable biologists that the variety of life forms is so extreme that each case has to be studied on its own without preconceptions.
Yeah.
And that was the same view in language.
Yes.
Martin Joseph's famous comment back in the 1950s in his collection of studies on structural linguistics was that he said we have to accept what he called the Roasian perspective, that each language is an object to be studied on its own without preconceptions because they vary so much and each is complex in so many ways. Well, in neither case, that couldn't be true in biology, and it couldn't be true in language, but it looked like that's what the facts were showing. And in both fields, sort of in parallel, and even with some interaction, things have moved towards a view where you can see that a large part of the diversity is really superficial. In the case of biological organisms, it's advanced to the point where one reputable biologist, Michael Sherman, has argued that there's in fact a universal genome, that at the time of the Cambrian explosion, a genome was formed and every life form is a minor variant on it. It's 500 million years, but that's kind of an extreme position, but it's not regarded as absurd. And there's enough known about conservation of genes and deep homologies and master genes and so on to make it look sort of reasonable. There has been a development somewhat in parallel in the study of language to the point where we can now speculate that there really is something like one language and that there are minor modifications.
And there's one life form.
And maybe one life form. No, things are moving in that direction. Actually, these are old debates. So in biology, it goes back to a famous controversy between around 1830 between what's his name? I can't remember the names, but two famous biologists, Cuvier and Jacques, one of whom argued that life forms are essentially the same, and the other that different. And it was assumed that the diversity won, and Darwin seemed to be leading in that direction, but now it looks like the pendulum's swinging back the other way.
There's this book by a man named Carroll.
Sean Carroll.
Yes.
Yeah, that's on what's called the Evo revolution. And that's kind of a review of a lot of the work that's showing how things are tending towards uniformity.
Not quite. No, I think we'd have to wrap it up.
Anyhow, just a word about evolution.
Oh, yeah.
If it's the case that we can, to the extent that we can show that there are basic principles that account for a substantial part of the nature of language, and that those principles are given to the organism, we can then ask a deeper question of what's given to the organism, how much is genetic and how much is laws of nature. Because remember, what's given kind of a priori from the organism's point of view is two categories. What's in the genes and what nature tells you has to happen. So in the biological case, when cells divide, they divide into spheres, not cubes. And that's not because there's a gene that says divide into spheres. That's because that's the way physics works. You want to minimize energy, you'll divide into.
Absolutely.
And it turns out there's quite a lot like that.
I've always been.
And the same apparently is true in language. So there are principles of efficient computation, which are probably laws of nature, which just hold for nature generally. And a lot of recent work has, here I'm expressing a minority view, but I think a lot of recent work has indicated that non-trivial parts of language are attributable just to the functioning of principles of efficient computation. Well, that tears away what has to be explained by an evolutionary account. It reduces it to the extent that you can show that laws of nature enter, you have less to account for in dealing with evolution. And by now, I think you can make some reasonable guesses.
I've always been struck by the fact that the simplest organism is, at the cell level, always takes the shape of a kind of a sphere. Then if you take a sphere and you put two holes in it, you get a tube. And that's what we are.
That's what we are.
We're tubes.
And
so you're either a sphere or a tube.
Well, by now, it's gone well beyond that. There's quite exciting work by Chris Cherniak, a mathematical biologist in Maryland, who's attempting to show, and has arguments that the sort of the wiring diagram, the structure, the way neurons are laid out, neural nets are laid out, for very simple organisms like nematodes, is optimal. That is, it's the best way you can do it. Like if an engineer were trying to do it, he would try to reach that ideal, but probably couldn't make it. And he goes on to argue that that's also the reason in this too, why the brain is always at one end and not in the middle, which is a universal property of animals. He tries to argue that that's optimal minimization of wiring, basically.
So to bring this to an end, unfortunately, we have to. It sounds like you're pretty optimistic about the field and where it's going.
Partially. On the other hand, there are countercurrents which I think are very harmful. So if you look at the amount of money spent in the field, or the number of people working on things, I think you find that most of them are trying to figure out what's going on outside the window by taking videotapes and doing statistical analysis of it. The fundamentally Galilean concept that you have to try to discover ideal cases and see if you can develop principles that will then ramify to account for the world. That's a very much a minority position.
I think it's probably human nature that we want to look out the window and you have to fight it.
Maybe. You can also get more money from the NSA.
Human nature. That's human nature too. Thank you very much, Noam. It's been great.